All right, we're going to talk about complex numbers. First thing that we want to do is look at our complex number system. So here's our complex number system. Here are our real numbers, rational, irrational, integers, whole numbers, natural numbers, and then our imaginary numbers. So the standard form of a complex number is a plus bi. A is the real part, bi is the imaginary part. It must be in standard form when you're plugging it in. Most of the time it tells you that in the directions. I is equal to the square root of -1. So therefore I squared is equal to -1. You use this right here a lot when you're talking about multiplying complex numbers. You use this right here when you're reducing radicals that have a negative. So here's an example of reducing a radical with a negative. You factor out the square root of -1, and that it becomes I. Adding complex numbers is just like binomials. So when addition is happening, the parentheses, they don't really matter. You just combine like terms. You combine the real part, you combine the imaginary part. All right, so let's look at our example here. So here we have our real part, and here we have our real part, and then here we have our imaginary part, and here we have our imaginary part. Now, obviously the plus that was in between these two, the parentheses don't matter, so we're going to combine our real part, 2, and then we have a positive 6i and a minus I, so then therefore we get plus 5i. Make sure your result is in standard form. Subtracting complex numbers is also just like binomials. When subtraction is happening, the parentheses do matter. You have to distribute the minus through that second parentheses. That way you get rid of your parentheses. You can then combine your like terms, you combine the real part, and then combine your imaginary part. Alright, so here is our example where we're going to subtract and write the result in standard form. Now in front of my parentheses I have a minus sign, so I need to make sure that I change all my signs first. So I have 8i minus 14 plus 9i. Alright, once I don't have parentheses anymore, then I can combine my like terms. Well, I see that I have no other real part, so again, making sure that you're writing it in standard form. My -14, and then I'm going to combine my two imaginary parts, so then I have plus 17i. Multiplying complex numbers. Even though I didn't write it on here, guess what? Just like polynomials. Distribute. Watch your signs. Always so important that you watch your signs. Combine your like terms. Simplify. Remember that I squared, as soon as you have I squared, it equals -1. Alright, so here's where we have a couple examples of multiply and write the results in standard form. So first thing I look at is I have -3i and then open parentheses 4 minus 2i. So that means between the parentheses and this term that's outside the parentheses, I know that multiplication is going on. So therefore I'm going to distribute. So -12i and then plus 6i squared. Now I would look at the fact that I have this I squared here. As soon as I have I squared, then I just go ahead and I cross it out, and I know that that's -6, because I squared means -1. So this says 6 times -1, so I get -6. Now I have to remember that I have to write it in standard form. So I have -6 minus 12i. Now, I know that you look at that and you say, oh, but I have like terms, maybe I can factor something. It's not about factoring. It's about simplifying and writing the result in standard form. All right, now let's go ahead and look at this other example that we have. So here I have 3 plus 4i times 2 minus 5i. So once again, between the parentheses, what's going on here? Well, it's multiplication. So here I need to distribute. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute my first term to both. 6 minus 15i. And then distribute here. So now I have plus 8i minus 20i squared. So once again, I see that I have this minus 20i squared, so that means I have 20 times -1. So this changes to then plus 20. So now I look at, all right, real, real. So therefore I have 26, imaginary, imaginary, combining those parts, -7i, those like terms. And there's my answer. All right, let's look at dividing complex numbers. When we're dividing complex numbers, you have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. It's always the conjugate of the denominator. The conjugate is the opposite of the imaginary part. So for example, if I had something like, let's say 5 plus 3i, my conjugate would then be 5 minus 3i. Even if my denominator was just, let's say, 7i, my conjugate is -7i. It's always the opposite of the imaginary part. So you multiply the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. Make sure to multiply all the way through. You simplify it into the form of a plus bi. The big thing here is that you have to make sure that if you have a fraction, you must separate your fraction. So you must separate your fraction. Here's our example of divide and express the result in standard form. So first of all, we look at this and then we know that we have to, since it's an imaginary number in the numerator and then we have an imaginary number in the denominator, we are going to have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of the denominator. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in parentheses, and then our conjugate is 3 minus 5i. There's my denominator multiplying the numerator by the same thing, 3 minus 5i. Distribute, so I get 12i minus 20i squared divided by 3 times 3 is 9. Then this is that special product where my middle terms subtract out. I would have a -15i and a +15i, but those subtract out, and then I have minus 25 I squared. So looking at now what I've multiplied here, I see that I have this minus 20i squared. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to plus 20. And here I'm going to change this to plus 25. So I change those terms because I have the I squared, which means I'm multiplying them times a -1. So now I have 20 plus 12i divided by 34. Now, because this is a fraction where you have an imaginary part to it, you must turn around and separate the fraction. I'm also going to go ahead and reduce it at the same time. They all, looking at all of my terms here, they all have a 2 in common, so therefore 10 divided by 17 plus 6 divided by 17i. All right, multiplying square roots of negatives. Do you see anything bold and underlined? The first thing that you have to do is you always have to reduce your radical. Factor out the I and reduce it if you can. It just makes your numbers smaller. But factor out the I and reduce your radical. Follow the operation and simplify.